8.3 notes focus on pelagic ecosystems. And if you recall, the pelagic zone is the water portion of the ocean. So we're talking about a vast area over which ecosystems can exist. Now we're first going to focus on what are called Neuston ecosystems. Neuston are kind of like plankton, nekton, and benthos. It's a type of organism that collect on top of the water. They can either float on top of the water or they live right under the surface. So the ones that live on top of the water, like this water strider that you see up here, and the Portuguese man-of-war, those would be Epineuston. Hyponeuston would be like the flying fish. They are always near the surface, and sometimes they jump out of the surface, as you can see in that picture. So Neuston are kind of, not all of them are planktonic, as you can see with the flying fish, but they tend to float near the surface. This is a very thin ecosystem. In some cases, it's only a few millimeters of surface water because it's right at the surface. Now, despite that, it is a major ecosystem because if you recall from Unit 1, we talked about how the ocean covers about 71% of the Earth's surface. So the entire surface of the ocean makes up this Neuston ecosystem. One area of concern is that because this is right at the interaction between the atmosphere and the ocean, it's severely affected by pollution. And later on, we're going to talk about a new concept that we're just kind of now becoming familiar with called ocean acidification, which is where too much carbon dioxide seems to be taken up by the ocean because carbon dioxide levels are increasing in the atmosphere. And this lowers the pH of the water, and that can severely affect not only coral reefs, but also organisms that live at the surface and are used to a more basic pH of water. Another type of Neuston ecosystem, or at least a specific type that we have here locally, is what's called the Sargasso Sea. And this is created by strands of brown algae called sargassum. And it accumulates in the middle of the North Atlantic Gyre, creating these big floating mats that you see over here in this picture. Now, a gyre, if you recall, a gyre is a big circular network of currents in each ocean basin. So in the North Atlantic Gyre, remember we have the Gulf Stream and the Canary Current and the North Equatorial Current. Well, those kind of are spinning around the outside of the ocean. The inside is kind of still, and all of this algae collects in there. Now, I say that this is a local ecosystem because it does affect us from time to time. Anytime there's a storm out in the ocean, it breaks off some of that sargassum and it starts floating towards the coastline. So sometimes it'll collect on our beaches in great quantities. And a lot of times you'll see it floating in with the waves. Now, it's an important seaweed because it supports a complex community, and in fact many of its inhabitants have adapted to look just like sargassum, like this sargassum fish that you see here. Notice he blends in very nicely with the sargassum. This is why I always tell students, whenever you see some of this brown seaweed washing in with the waves, go up to it, pick it up, because you'll find all sorts of stuff. You'll find sargassum fish, you'll find seahorses, and little crabs and all sorts of things that are very nicely adapted to live within this type of seaweed. Now, another type of pelagic ecosystem other than the Neuston would be the continental shelf. And in particular, what's on the neritic zone is very interesting, especially to fishery scientists. We'll talk about that in a moment. The neritic zone, remember, is the ocean zone that is above the continental shelf. It is considered to be the most productive region in the ocean, and here's why. It gets nutrients not only from river runoff, but also from upwelling currents. Remember, those are the cold currents that bring nutrients up from the bottom of the ocean. Another interesting thing about the neritic zone is that it does not exceed 200 meters. So this means it's always in the photic zone. So not only does it have a lot of nutrients, but it always has light. And if you recall from Unit 7, light and nutrients together give us plenty of productivity. So that's why the neritic zone is so productive. And in fact, globally, if we look at this map, the areas with the highest upwelling activity have the highest nutrient levels. And this corresponds to many of the most productive regions in the ocean. And notice, interestingly, they all tend to be on the western side of continents. Not always, but usually. And we focus here on Peru. There's a lot of upwelling there, and that's one of the biggest fishing areas in the world. So these are all very good fishing areas, especially for commercial fisheries that catch like anchovies and sardines and other things like that. So again, the continental shelf is a very productive ecosystem because of upwelling and river runoff.